Thank you to Jewish Voice for Peace New York for inviting me to speak here this evening about the topic of U.S. military aid to Israel and what we can do to end this policy. So as was mentioned in the introduction, my name is Josh Ruebner. I'm the policy director of the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation. We are a national coalition of more than 400 organizations that are working together to challenge our country's complicity in Israel's human rights abuses of the Palestinian people and to change our policy to support human rights, international law, and equality. And one of the center points of our policy organizing is to challenge the billions of dollars that we provide in weapons to Israel every year, which plays such a harmful role in perpetuating the oppression that Israel metes out to the Palestinian people. And let me just say that Jewish Voice for Peace is one very important member of our coalition, which we work with on any number of campaigns. Before I get into the presentation, I'm sure that for most, if not all of us, Israel's attack upon Gaza is at the forefront of our minds. This horrific attack this summer, who can forget the indelible images from the beach of Gaza City when an Israeli naval artillery shell killed the four Becker cousins, ages 8 to 11, in front of the eyes of the international media. For me, it's difficult to forget the story of Shema Sheikh Kanan, who was aged 23 and pregnant for the first time in her young life, 8 months pregnant, when she was killed, buried under the rubble of her home by an Israeli tank artillery shell. Her body was pulled from the rubble. She was brought to the hospital, deceased, but the doctors miraculously delivered her unborn child via cesarean section. And this child was named after her deceased mother, Shema. And the birth of this miracle child was viewed in many respects as a rebirth of Palestinian life within the midst of this horrific and barbaric attack to which the population of the Gaza Strip was subjected. But sadly, the miracle child, Shema, only lived for 5 days because the incubator that was sustaining her life, the power to it was shut off after Israel deliberately attacked Gaza's only electrical power plant, and she died as a result of the electricity being cut off. These are some of the many, many horrific stories which emerged this summer from the Gaza Strip. And of course, all of the weapons which were employed by Israel to commit these massacres, more than 2,100 Palestinians killed, more than 500 children killed, 11,000 wounded, more than 18,000 homes damaged or destroyed, 140 schools damaged or destroyed, nearly 550 businesses damaged or destroyed. 6% of the entire population of the Gaza Strip was deliberately made homeless by Israel's attacks this summer. And all of this was accomplished with the weapons that we as taxpayers provide to Israel at taxpayer expense, from the F-16 fighter jets to the Apache helicopter gunships to the, quote, Hellfire missiles that rain down on the people of Gaza from both of these platforms, to the naval boats which killed the Becker cousins on the beach of Gaza City. These are all U.S. weapons that we pay for and provide to Israel. And at the height of Israel's attack this summer on the Gaza Strip, yes, President Obama expressed his concern about the mounting civilian death toll. He expressed his concern about the fact that so many civilians were losing their life. But at the very same time that President Obama was expressing his so-called concern for this loss of Palestinian life, he actually allowed Israel to draw down from existing stockpiles of U.S. weapons, which are located in Israel. By the way, the United States does this in more countries than not, in terms of pre-positioning weapons in foreign countries to use for attacks. And so President Obama allowed Israel to draw down from existing stockpiles of U.S. weapons to replenish its arsenal with the same tank artillery shells, the same bazooka shells, which were used to demolish entire Palestinian neighborhoods, raze them to the ground. Neighborhoods like Shujaiya, like Khuzaa, where human rights organizations have documented that massacres were committed. Now, it's true that a Wall Street Journal article came out at the height of the fighting saying that the president had temporarily suspended the delivery of Hellfire missiles to Israel because the Obama administration was concerned about how these missiles were being used. But the very next day, stories emerged that the decision had been reversed. So the flow of weapons from the United States to Israel has been unremitting, has continued unabated despite the massacres which took place in the Gaza Strip this summer. And I'm sure this is something that's all on our minds and is background for what I'd like to do over the next half hour or so, which is the following. To look at the question, I don't know if this audience is going to need a lot of convincing or not, why challenge military aid to Israel? Why should this be a part of the activism we are committed to? I'll give you a little bit of background info on military aid to Israel and tell you a little bit about the budgetary process, about how it actually works from the United States and Congress actually giving Israel the money for these weapons. Then we're going to look at some of the laws which are supposed to govern U.S. foreign policy, and these laws, I think, are especially important in terms of the advocacy work that we do with our members of Congress. And then I'll talk a little bit about different things that we're doing to organize, to challenge military aid, and give you some online resources that we have that can help you in this process. Okay. So yes, some of the reasons in terms of our framing of why we challenge U.S. military aid to Israel, why we work for an end to it. Israel is committing human rights violations and even war crimes and potential crimes against humanity with these weapons in violation of our own laws. We have untold, unmet domestic needs in this country. And exactly as was said, that by funding Israel's war crimes against the Palestinians, we are using money which could be otherwise put to better use to fund these unmet domestic needs. And then third, which nobody mentioned, which I was surprised, maybe because you're not convinced, but we as a country believe that we have a foreign policy that is based upon respect for human dignity and human rights. And in fact, this commitment is actually written into some of these U.S. laws, which I'll cover in just a few minutes. And so for people who believe that our foreign policy is or should be based on human rights and international law, obviously our support in military aid for Israel calls into question, at the very least, putting it nicely, calls into question our commitment to these principles. So let me give you a little bit of background information in terms of the scope of aid that we are talking about. Between 1949, which was the first year the United States provided any form of aid to Israel, 1 year after its establishment, up until the year 2008, the United States gave Israel more than $100 billion in both economic and military aid. Now, since Camp David was signed between Israel and Egypt in 1978, the United States and Israel have had 10-year what are called memorandum of understandings to govern the aid framework for that decade. So the current 10-year framework that we're in right now goes from 2008 to 2017. So we're almost at the end of this current decade. More on that in just a second. The last phase that was completed ran from 1999 to 2008. And FY just means fiscal year. That's probably about as like budgetary wonky as I'm going to get on you this evening. So up until 1999, there was a mix of both economic aid, which was a direct grant to Israel's budget, and military aid in the form of cash payments for weapons. The current Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who was also Prime Minister back in the late 1990s, what he did was agreed with the United States that from 1999 to 2008, what the two countries would do would be to step down, to phase out economic aid every year, and increase military aid every year. So before this MOU was signed, it was about $1.6 billion a year in military aid and about $1.4 billion in economic aid, roughly 50-50 between the two. What Netanyahu and the Clinton administration agreed upon was that by the end of this MOU, in 2008, all of the economic aid would be phased out and the military aid would be stepped up, so that at the end of 2008, we were no longer providing Israel with any economic aid. It was all military in nature. And by the end of this agreement in 2008, we were providing Israel with about $2.5 billion worth of weapons every year. During the George W. Bush administration, the United States and Israel signed another memorandum of understanding, this time for the years 2009 to 2018. So this is the agreement that we are in right now, that we're almost at the end of, because now we're already at the 2015 budget cycle. And what Israel and the United States agreed to do under the Bush administration was to take this baseline of $2.5 billion of weapons to Israel every year and step it up in increments every year to eventually reach $3.1 billion annually, totaling $30 billion over the course of this decade. So when you hear the tagline, the slogan, end $30 billion in weapons to Israel, which is something that we've been promoting for years. How many of you all have heard of that, ending $30 billion? So that refers to this 10-year agreement that we're in right now to give Israel $30 billion of weapons from now until 2018. And what this represents is an annual average increase of 25% in military aid over and above the previous levels. Let me stop and see if there are any questions about where we're at in this current round of the Memorandum of Understanding. Okay. So you can see I put this together initially a couple years ago. We're now, as I mentioned, in the 2015 budget cycle, and we're into the point of this Memorandum of Understanding where it's $3.1 billion every year. This is only military aid. This does not include roughly another $500 million of money which is granted to joint U.S.-Israeli defense projects. These are the anti-missile projects, especially the Iron Dome that you've heard a lot about recently, that the United States gave Israel 225 million, additional dollars this summer. So it's 3.1 billion in weapons, plus what the Pentagon gives, another $500 million or so every year in so-called joint U.S.-Israeli anti-missile projects. So when you total these two together, we're looking at more like $3.5 billion in weaponry every year. Any questions? Okay. How many people remember when President Obama went to Jerusalem last year in the spring of 2013? This was his first trip abroad in his second term. During this trip to Jerusalem, President Obama said that he wanted to extend U.S. military aid to Israel upon the expiration of this current Memorandum of Understanding, which, as I mentioned, ends in 2018. And the Obama administration leaked to the press at the time of his trip that he wanted to negotiate a deal with Israel that would provide it with an additional $40 billion in weapons until 2028. If this negotiation takes place and this memorandum of understanding is signed, this will be Obama's legacy on the Israel-Palestine issue and not peace. So George W. Bush increased the amount of military aid that we provide to Israel from about 2.5 to about $3 billion a year. President Obama now wants to extend it to $4 billion a year. This is why in my book I write about how under the Obama administration, despite the president's rhetorical empathy for the Palestinian plight, our complicity in Israel's occupation and oppression of the Palestinian people has actually deepened and strengthened in many ways. I think Obama really understands the nature of Israel's oppression toward the Palestinians much better than any sitting U.S. president has before. In my book, I document the early years of Obama, the politician, when, as an Illinois state senator, he was on very friendly terms with the local Palestinian American voting bloc in his district and attended their community events and fundraisers and so on and so forth. And was quite friendly with many prominent Palestinians in his district. So he knows what's going on. I think he thinks he's doing the best that he can. Okay. Let me run through the budgetary process. This is, in an ideal world, how Congress is supposed to work. But what's Congress's approval rating these days? What is it, like 5%? Something like that? The reason why Congress's approval rating is so low, or at least one of the reasons, is because they can't even do the job that we elect them to do, which is to pass a budget for the United States of America. So this is theoretically how the budget process is supposed to work, like if you take a Civics 101 course, but in recent years, it doesn't at all look like this. So let me tell you how it's supposed to work, and this is in response to your question. At the beginning of the year, the president submits to Congress a budget request, and in it are all kinds of line items for every single program the United States government funds. The budget is cut into 13 different bills. It's sent to different appropriations committees that have jurisdiction over these bills. And the committee which deals with the appropriations of all foreign aid is the Appropriations Subcommittee on State Department, Foreign Operations, and Related Programs. Now, if you have a member of Congress who serves on this Appropriations Subcommittee, this member of Congress has extreme amount of leverage over the foreign aid budget. So to be honest, I'm not sure if there are any New York City members of Congress who are on these committees. That's something that you all can look up as part of your campaign to end military aid to Israel. But if they are, they have more leverage and more influence over this than most. Because when the budget goes to them, they can say, well, we want to increase or decrease the president's request. They can say, we want to stick conditions in the budget that will limit how these weapons can be used. And so what they do is they hold hearings in the spring, and then they do what are called markups, where they usually meet in secret to make these amendments to the president's request. After that, the whole committee votes on it. And the way that Congress is supposed to work is that they pass all these different appropriation bills. They go to the president for signature. He signs them into law before the start of the fiscal year, which begins on October 1st. This is very confusing. So the fiscal year 2015 actually starts on October 1st, 2014. Why they did it like this, I don't know, but it's very confusing to me. So right now, Congress is actually working on the 2015 budget. And of course, they skip town to go home to raise money for the elections without having passed a budget like they were supposed to do by October 1st. This is why I say this process almost never works out this way, which is actually a good thing for advocates who support ending military aid to Israel, because until the budget's passed, Israel doesn't get its money. So at least the gridlock in Congress is good for one thing. So the way that it is supposed to work, by the way, there are a couple of exemptions that Israel gets in terms of its military aid when the budget is finally passed. There are two major exemptions that single out Israel for special treatment. One is that within 30 days of the budget passing, Israel gets all of its appropriation for the year. Every other country around the world that receives any form of U.S. aid gets it in quarterly installments. So why is this important? Because what Israel does is it takes this $3.1 billion and it places the money into an interest-bearing account, actually here in New York, and earns interest on this appropriation so that the $3.1 billion is actually more than $3.1 billion. And then they draw down from this account to so-called purchase the weapons. For those of you who are following me on Facebook, I made some snarky comments today about how Israel's purchasing additional F-35 fighter jets. It's not purchasing them. They're taking the money that we provide them to get these weapons. So that's one exemption that Israel has. The second exemption is all other countries are required to spend all military aid on U.S. corporations. Israel, singled out for special treatment, can spend up to 25% of this military aid on its own weapons industry. So we are also providing the Israeli military industrial complex with a $750 million subsidy every year to advance their weapons purchases. So let me spend a few minutes talking about some of the laws which are supposed to govern how we provide foreign aid to a country. There are three main laws that I want to talk about tonight. One is called the Foreign Assistance Act. This is sort of the meta law, which governs all forms of U.S. foreign assistance, whether it's military or economic or multilateral in nature. And as you can see, the Foreign Assistance Act is very clear. No assistance can be provided to the government of any country that engages in a consistent pattern of gross violations of internationally recognized human rights. Does this sound like any country that we're discussing tonight. So this is a potent tool for activists like yourselves to go to your members of Congress and ask them why this law is being ignored when it comes to military aid to Israel. And if you bring them a whole bookshelf full of UN reports and Israeli human rights reports and Palestinian human rights reports, perhaps they'll dismiss them all as being anti-Semitic or self-hating. Perhaps they will. Perhaps they won't. Maybe they will read them and think again. But what you can do is take to them, you can print out from the website of the State Department its annual report on the human rights practices of every single country in the world, except for the United States. And in the State Department's annual report on Israel's human rights practices, you will indeed see that even the State Department acknowledges that Israel is committing massive and systematic human rights abuses against the Palestinian people. So this is one branch of the US government telling another branch of the US government that these human rights abuses are being committed, and everyone completely turning a blind eye to this law, which in black and white is very clear. You don't get any military aid, you don't get any economic aid if you're committing human rights abuses. 2, the Arms Export Control Act. So I mentioned the Foreign Assistance Act is kind of like the meta law, which governs all of our foreign aid programs. The Arms Export Control Act is more narrow. It focuses only on weapons. And it's a very good law. There are only a few circumstances in which a foreign country can use US weapons. Now, aside from ones that I didn't put up here, which are obscure and don't have any relevance to what we're talking about tonight, like engaging in multilateral peacekeeping operations or destroying weapons of mass destruction, which even Israel recognizes Palestinians don't have. The only use that US weapons can be put to are for, quote, internal security and, quote, legitimate self-defense. So when Israel uses US supplied weapons to perpetuate its military occupation of Palestinian lands, it is de facto in violation of this law. Because Israel is not engaged in legitimate self-defense. It's not self-defense to colonize one's land. It's not legitimate self-defense to demolish one's home, to destroy agriculture, to expel people from their homes and their lands, to target civilian infrastructure, to kill civilians. None of this is considered legitimate self-defense under international law. In fact, these are all war crimes. Everything that I mentioned is a war crime. So the building of illegal Israeli colonies on Palestinian land, it's not just an obstacle to peace, it's a war crime. So what Israel is doing in this military occupation of Palestinian land is not legitimate self-defense. Legitimate self-defense means you are protecting yourself from an armed attack against a sovereign country. Period. That's what self-defense means under international law. And clearly, internal security does not apply, because the way internal security is interpreted in this law is that it is for policing purposes within your sovereign borders, not to enforce a foreign military occupation. So again, here we have a law which is good in its intent, being completely ignored by the White House and by our members of Congress when it comes to continuing the flow of weapons to Israel. Citizens cannot bring a lawsuit against their government for failing to obey the laws that they write and implement. There is one law that some people have tried to use to sue corporations that have profiteered from these weapon sales. And this is the Alien Torts Claims Act, which was a law which was recently just gutted by the Roberts Supreme Court. Basically has no meaning anymore. This was the law under which the Shell Oil Corporation was sued for complicity with human rights abuses in Nigeria. This is a law that the family of Rachel Corrie, the U.S. activist who was killed by Israel with a Caterpillar bulldozer, tried to use to sue the Caterpillar Corporation in U.S. courts unsuccessfully. So people have tried to use the Alien Torts Claim Act for this purpose, but so far have not been successful with that. If you go to our website, aidtoisrael.org, and you go to our policy paper there, all of this information is on our website at aidtoisrael.org, and you can download or read it online there. And it actually goes through many, many historical examples about how the Arms Export Control Act has been applied to other foreign countries and actually to Israel on several different occasions. Let me move on to the third law, which is actually a part of the Foreign Assistance Act. It's called the Leahy Law, named for the Vermont senator, Senator Leahy. He wrote the law. And this is a more micro version that is supposed to cut off U.S. aid to any unit of a military which is committed gross violations of human rights. Now, there's another component to the Leahy Law, which is that any military figure who has committed a human rights abuse is denied a visa to enter the United States. One of the problems with the Leahy Law is that it's very opaque. It's impossible to know if the State Department has actually invoked this Leahy Law with any country. Even Congress doesn't know. It's very secretive. So Israel may have been sanctioned, and we have quite a lot of circumstantial evidence that Israel has been sanctioned under this law in the previous few years, because high-ranking Israeli military figures have been denied visas to enter the United States. So we do think that this law is being applied somewhat to Israel. But like I mentioned, it's at the micro level of targeting specific individuals and specific units. So these are the three major laws that we can use to advocate for challenging military aid to Israel with our members of Congress, with the Obama administration. We're not asking them to do anything other than apply the laws that currently exist. That's it. Just hold true to the laws that they passed. That's all we're asking. It's not that hard. Okay, so let's move on to the more activist component of this talk. Let me give you a few resources that you can get from our website to help educate and organize people. I apologize. A lot of these resources are actually in the process of being redesigned, but you can go on our website, and don't worry, I'm going to give you the websites in just a second. And you can get things like fact sheets and posters and postcards and petitions and stickers and all that stuff to download. Okay. Let me tell you what some of our member groups are doing across the country. I mentioned that we're a coalition of 400 organizations, and I know that here in New York, organizations have placed subway ads calling for an end to U.S. military aid to Israel. And in fact, what we've seen is really a proliferation of these type of ads throughout the country. And typically what will happen is that an ad like this, which comes from Albuquerque, New Mexico, will go up. The pro-Israel community will huff and puff and put up their own billboard. And what does the media love? Controversy. And so you have dueling billboards, and it gets a huge amount of media attention, and it opens up the conversation in the community about what these weapons are doing to the Palestinian people, and conversely, what we could be better spending this money on. So that's one very effective way of raising public awareness. This was, I think, the ad that appeared in the New York subway. This particular one, I think, came from the Boston system, but it was the same ad or similar one where you have Palestinians and Israelis, and these are actually real people who believe this, saying, be on our side, we want you to work to end U.S. aid to Israel. Okay, so let me give you a few more examples of some of our online resources to help you educate and organize people. One is our website, aidtoisrael.org. And if you didn't get the URL, don't worry, I'll give it to you at the end. The primary focus of aidtoisrael.org is an interactive database which allows you to look up how much military aid people from your communities will be providing to Israel in this $30 billion package that I outlined before. And you can look it up at the state level, the congressional level, county, and city level. I apologize for not knowing the exact amount for New York City, but I'm positive that it's over $1 billion. So New Yorkers will be giving more than $1 billion of their taxes in weapons to Israel from 2009 to 2018. So this is one component of this website. It tells you how much money is being spent by your community on these weapons, but it also gives you the economic trade-offs that are involved. And this goes back to your comments about what could this same amount of money fund. So you can look to see that here I took the example of Iowa, where the entire state's providing more than $200 million in weapons to Israel. And we determined with that same amount of money, the US government could provide families with affordable housing grants, more than 2,600 of them per year. Or more than 3,500 people could be retrained for the green jobs economy. Or more than 6,000 at-risk young students could receive early reading education programs. Or get this, we actually found a government program where doctors and nurses donate their time, and it only costs about $70 per person to treat people for primary health care. We found that with the same amount of money that people in Iowa are spending on giving Israel weapons, this could actually provide primary health care to more than 170,000 uninsured people. So these are very real trade-offs, and you can go on our website and look. We have like a detailed methodology of how we got these figures and the sources and everything. It's totally legit. Nobody's ever questioned how we got these figures. And you can see that there are actual real economic trade-offs. So why did we do this? To not only make the case that we should be ending military aid to Israel on a moral basis, but to enable activists like you who are interested in this issue to have an issue to reach out to community organizers organizing for social justice on other issues, and to present this to them as a win-win. Yes, we need more money for affordable housing. Yes, we need more money for healthcare. Yes, we need more money for any number of things. And here's how we can do it. Let's advocate together to end weapons to Israel and redirect this money to what we need to be spending things on, human needs. It's definitely a good point to raise, especially because the United States provides military aid to other human rights abusing regimes, especially in Latin America. Israel gets 60% of the entire military aid budget. The entire military aid budget is $5 billion a year. Israel gets $3.1 billion. Egypt is second and gets, I think it's $1.2 billion a year. So between Israel and Egypt, that's like 80% of the entire military aid budget. And so all the others are very small in comparison. Okay, let me tell you about another website that we have. It is weaponstoisrael.org. And we actually did it much better than this particular slide. We redid it last year. And we have about, I think it's 8 or 9 different interactive databases on this website which show you a couple of things. One It maps out the Israeli weapons manufacturers that are operating subsidiaries in the United States, and there are dozens of them. So this makes for a great BDS target, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, where you can go to the local corporation that's making these weapons and protest there. Also, we have 5 or 6 different US government databases. We've dug up an incredible amount of detail on the contracts for the weapons that have been given to Israel since 2000. What we found is that since 2000, the United States has given Israel more than 800 million weapons and rounds of ammunition. 800 million. And so we have the details of what these weapons are on this website, and with details about, in many cases, who makes them, which corporations, where the weapons are actually being produced, etc. It's a ton of information. I could spend like 6 hours showing you all this information and we still wouldn't cover it all. It's like thousands and thousands of data. That's what's on weaponstoisrael.org. The third website that I want to give you is fundcommunityneeds.org. This is a sort of campaign in a box if you're interested in running a city council campaign to bring a resolution to your city council using the money that's on our website, Aid to Israel, to say, New York City, wouldn't it be better, instead of spending $1 billion in weapons to Israel, that we spent the money on this here at home instead? So if you go to this website, there's sort of a campaign in the box for you if you're interested in that, and we can provide support for you if you decide to do that type of campaign. It has a how-to organizing guide. It's got some other resources. It's got a template resolution that you can download, and I'm very sure that, what's his name? Doug Heikens? I'm very sure that he would support that city council resolution if you brought it to him. So those are some of the online resources that we have that can help you educate and organize people and further your own education about what military aid to Israel actually is. So in summary, aidtoisrael.org is where you can go to get the figures on how much your community is providing in weapons to Israel and what that money could provide instead for human needs. Weaponstoisrael.org is where you go to get into the nitty-gritty details of the weapons that were actually provided to Israel. And fundcommunityneeds.org is where you can go to get more ideas for this city council resolution campaign. Or if you want to make it super easy, just go to our main website, which is endtheoccupation.org, and you can get to all of those websites from there as well. So I hope that this has provided you with some more info and background and ideas for ways to educate and organize people here in New York about military aid. I do have a few minutes for Q&A. Israel has the 5th largest military industrial complex in the world in terms of exporting weapons. The 5th largest in the entire world. The only thing that Israel doesn't build on its own are the fighter jets and the attack helicopter gunships. Everything else, and the naval gunships, although they make some smaller naval gunships. Everything else, the missiles, the ammunition, the guns, Israel makes that, and their companies export it abroad, including especially drones, which is an Israeli military technology. So if Israel were cut off from the US market, yeah, it would lose access to some of the most sophisticated weapons in the US arsenal. But even if the current military balance remained without Israel getting any additional US weapons, it would still be far superior to any combination of potential adversaries that it would face. And in fact, written into US law, which I should really add into this presentation, is something called QME. The United States is committed to ensuring Israel's QME, which stands for Qualitative Military Edge. Written into the law of the United States is that every arms sale to the Middle East must take into account the military balance and ensure that Israel has a qualitative military edge over any combination of potential adversaries in the region. That's actually law in the United States, introduced by Representative Howard Berman. Okay. $3.1 billion is really a drop in the bucket for the U.S. military-industrial complex. I mean, the amount of money it makes off of Pentagon contracts in 1 year is tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars every year. Pentagon contracts with the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower were alive today, what would he have to say about what has become of the military-industrial complex? Because you look at what he warned about 50 years ago, and has greatly exceeded, I think, what he could ever have predicted. So it's a drop in the bucket, but it's important. It's important for this reason. And I hate saying this, but it's absolutely true that Palestinians are guinea pigs for weapons development. Both Israeli weapons are tested out on Palestinians and marketed as being, quote, battle tested. And you actually have seen Israeli military industrial corporations say that brand new, just used this summer. These are battle tested, proven, and they use this to market to other militaries around the world. And the reality is that a lot of US prototypes are first used against Palestinians before they're put into the US arsenal. So it's a very important R&D lab. It's a very important R&D lab. The Samson option, which was a book written by Sy Hersh back in the 1980s, I think, refers to Israel's nuclear arsenal. And Israel has conceived of its nuclear arsenal as a Samson option, as a last-ditch kind of, if you're going to take us down, we're going to take everybody down. It's a doomsday scenario. I mean, given the current realities of Israeli politics, I cannot rule out that Israel would consider using its nuclear weapons at some point in the future. Hopefully it won't get to that, but it is something to keep in mind as an option that's in Israel's arsenal to use these weapons. So with that, I want to thank you all so much for coming. Thank JVP New York for bringing me here, and please come and check out my book. Thank you very much for having me.
Jewish Voice for Peace, the New York City chapter. We're a member of a national organization that has 60 chapters across the country. Our chapter here in New York City has been growing by leaps and bounds over the last few months, and we're having meetings of 30 people on average. We encourage you to join us, and hopefully after this talk you'll want to even more. We meet every fourth Monday of the month right here, and this church has offered us their space for free, which we really appreciate. And we have various committees that we're hierarchically structured, so we have committees that everyone can be involved in, and we encourage you to join us as we embark on this new campaign. We worked very hard on a SodaStream boycott over last winter and into the spring up until the attacks on Gaza, when we got involved in that very much. But so we like to think that we're part of what just the announcement that SodaStream is closing or is planning to close its factory in the illegal settlement. It's planning to move it, but we think that is due to pressure from international protest movement that we were very much a part of. So now as we embark on this new campaign, we just really invite you all to join us. Somebody asked if you have to be Jewish to be in Jewish Voice for Peace, and the answer is no. We're really big on coalitions and allies, and it's a matter of really wanting to foreground in this country where the idea that whatever Israel does or the U.S. government in support of Israel is done in the names of Jews, and we want to make sure that an alternate voice says no, not in our name, but we're an inclusive organization.